2 prize heads. "Hello there," said my new mate, shaking my hand. "I presume you are the person for whom I have been waiting these past 2 days. My name's Wilmer." He was tall and thin, with a short mustache and a long bunch of whiskers hanging off the end of his chin. He sounded like a Pommy, but reckoned he came from the Argentine and was having a go at the job for experience. He informed me at once that the use of bad language and calling him Will for short were 2 vulgarities he couldn't countenance. Coarse behavior was a sign of immaturity, and he was going to introduce me to the ways of civilized and healthy living, which he said had kept him in good nick for 42 years. He'd have done better to start on the hut, which was in a filthy mess. The first lesson in civilized behavior was a demonstration of how to eat enough food at one sitting to stagger a pair of pack horses. During the meal, he lectured me on the evils of smoking till I felt guilty every time I reached for my tobacco packet. Flynn crept into the hut looking for scraps, and I got such a colorful description of the effects of hybrid cysts on the human liver and lungs that I almost developed the symptoms. I took Flynn gingerly outside and tied him to a log about 100 yards away from the camp. That evening, while I baked a couple of loaves of bread, Wilmer proved beyond all dispute by brilliant deduction that Queen Victoria was perverted, that one of his own ancestors wrote under the name of William Shakespeare, that Winston Churchill was an impostor, and that the present birth rate in Indochina would make the world so top-heavy that in 10 years it would start to wobble and eventually spin in a northeast by southwest direction. I believed all this, and finally went to sleep with my head reeling from all the startling bits of information that had been poured into my unaccustomed ears. I was greatly impressed by Wilmer's education and cultured accent. He used more big words than I knew existed. Also, I had been on my own for some weeks, and was unused to conversation of any kind. My first inkling that Wilmer might not be infallible came with his decision to fill a water bottle in case we got thirsty on the trip across the lake to Chapman's next morning. When I pointed out that the lake was full of fresh water, he almost dispelled my doubts by telling me about the disease-carrying germs which lurked in stagnant water. Then I remembered that he'd filled his bottle from the lake edge, and roared with laughter. Wilmer glared pompously from where he sat in the bow of the boat, framed against the misty Warrare Bluffs, and coldly informed me that my vulgarity was rendered tolerable only by my pathetic innocence. I was then given a further lecture on civilized behavior. Our arrival at Chapman's hut cut short the story of how Wilmer had had to leave home because of his great intellectual superiority over the rest of the family. It took him 9 trips to bring about 70 pounds of gear up from the boat. While I cut fresh fern for the bunks, Wilmer prepared luncheon: 4 enormous slabs of meat, 2 tins of peas, a large billy of spuds, and half a loaf of bread. 2 weeks of this, and we were going to be out of grub. I decided to spend the rest of the day working round the camp, so Wilmer took his rifle and 100 rounds of ammunition and went off to inspect the surrounding vegetation for the spoor of wild animals. In 2 hours I heard about 15 shots within a radius of a half-mile of the camp. Wilmer was either a remarkable hunter or an absolute fool. If this was one of Jim's good keen men, I was going to ask him for a woman next time. Remembering Wilmer's great appetite, I rowed across the bay to a creek, tickled a few trout in case he didn't bring any meat back, and hung them in the chimney to smoke. After that, I put Flynn up a few of the handy gullies in hope of nailing a pig, but all Wilmer's shooting must have scared them away. I returned before dark, and hung a large camp oven of stew over the fire. Wilmer was still letting off the odd shot or two, when it was too dark in the bush to see more than a few feet, so I fired a couple of rounds in the air in case he was lost. All this shooting was going to louse up the chances of getting any handy deer in the morning. He staggered into the hut an hour after dark without a single tail. Lord knows what he'd been shooting at. He scraped the camp oven clean of stew, ate the best part of a loaf of bread, and crawled into his bunk, insisting an absolute silence while he cured a sprained muscle in his leg by self-hypnosis. He was asleep 10 minutes after he lay down, snoring politely. The next day he spent in his bunk, and would only stir himself to eat his customary camp oven of stew or roast meat and his half-loaf of bread. In spite of his shooting the day before, I got 7 deer, and Flynn caught a young sow in the bush above the hut, which was a record for that area. I spent 2 weeks at Chapman's with Wilmer, at the end of which time we were running low in grub, and it became clear that one of us was slightly loopy. We were gutting some trout in a little bay to the east of Chapman's one morning, and I'd mislaid my knife, though I knew it was lying around somewhere. "Can you see my knife anywhere, Wilmer?" I said. He took one brief look round, and said to leave it for a while. They'd put it back in a minute. He handed me his knife to use. Startled, I asked who they were. He explained that whenever a thing goes missing that you know is just in front of you, and you suddenly find that you've been looking at it all the time, it's because little men from Mars have taken it to make a pattern from. Having done this, they put it back again. I pitied poor Wilmer, but was embarrassed to find that my knife had been lying beside my boot all the time. Another time I told him how a hut I'd once stayed in on the tops was so exposed it had to be wired to logs buried in the ground to prevent the wind blowing it over. Wilmer said that it reminded him of a village in the Argentine mountains where all the houses had to be completely buried because the wind blew big boulders about as if they were snowflakes. I asked him, didn't all the animals get blown away? He said they did, but it didn't matter because the inhabitants just used the ones blown along from the next village until another breeze blew their own back again. One of his friends had also lost 4 wives in this way, and kept the 5th chained to the doorpost for fear of losing her too. Wilmer got a letter one day, the first since we'd been there. It had "Protect Your Credit" printed on the envelope and looked like an ordinary bill, but Wilmer got really worked up about it. He stared intently at the one page for about 10 minutes, occasionally muttering, "Well, I never," "Astounding," and "Good heavens," as though it was something terribly important. After a while, he began writing a reply, and only once in the next hour broke the silence to ask me if a count should have 2 C's or only 1. That was the only time Wilmer ever asked me anything, except once when he asked me did I obtain some kind of morbid amusement out of throwing a handful of coffee on the fire before I went for the morning shoot. It smoked the poor beggar out of bed too early for his usual obvious predictions about the weather to be accurate. He came back with a deer tail one night and told me he knew how to get any number of them. You just pointed the rifle and fired. Aiming only spoilt your instinctive shooting. I congratulated him as heartily as possible and hoped he wouldn't get too many tails, or Jim would keep him on the job. He was due for the boot next time Jim came for not getting enough deer, and I didn't want any miracles upsetting the proper course of events. 2 months' supplies looked like lasting 3 weeks. We moved over to White Bull Beach on the far side of Lake Waikare-Iti, and I decided to fly camp up the Rakituri River on my own. I normally wouldn't have bothered going there, but Wilmer was getting me down a little, and besides, it was about the only place on the neighboring block I'd not touched. I was a bit uneasy about leaving Wilmer on his own, but I was more uneasy about staying with him, so I threw a bit of rice, tea, and salt into my pack, untied the dog, and left the hut. I got 4 deer between the camp and the first big waterfall, and hid the tails in a tree to save carting them with me. Then I tackled the fall. Flynn nearly knocked me off the cliff trying to get past when we were about halfway up. But apart from that, we made it to the top with very little trouble. Above the waterfall, the river leveled out for about 50 yards and then rose steeply in a series of small cascades and rapids. It was pretty rough going until the creek widened a bit. Soon I bowled a young stag, and Flynn grabbed a pig at the same time. Then 2 hinds ran out of a patch of bush lawyer and stopped, looking back. I dropped both of them. Flynn ran across and tried to get up the bank on the far side of the creek, slipping back on the wet rock. I dashed over and shot a stag that was looking down through the bush. He just about landed on Flynn, who was having another go at getting up the bank. All this in the course of about 20 minutes. This was really worth going after. 8 deer and a pig with 10 shots, and only 10 o'clock in the morning. The next waterfall was a beauty. Spray wet the bush for 100 yards around, and roared in our ears for 3.5 hours as we dragged ourselves up the steep, rocky side of the gorge. Several times I had to go back and push Flynn up in front of me, and once I dislodged a few yards of loose rock and thought we were goners. I grabbed a birch root and clung there. Flynn bit my leg in the excitement. We climbed well above the falls and found a place in the steep bush where we could sidle round them. I slid the last 50 yards into the river bed farther on, shot a fawn that was standing there, and flopped, exhausted, bruised, and soaked with sweat, on a mossy bank. In 4 hours there hadn't been one place we could rest or even stop. We struck a few more small waterfalls and a lot of steep, gorgy places where the slippery rocks made travel slow and difficult. I saw another 8 deer and got 6 of them by the time we reached a place where the river forked. I spent the last hour of daylight hanging the tent and gathering firewood. 14 deer and a pig, but hell, we were tired. Flynn ate his meat and lay still at the end of the tent while I sat smoking, too worn out and too sleepy, wondering how we were going to get back down that waterfall. The gray morning showed trout running up the creek in hundreds. I would have thought the big waterfall would have stopped them, but I wasn't going to complain about having fresh, fat trout for breakfast. I sconed a nice little 6-pounder with a rock, stuffed it with boiled rice, and cooked it in leaves. It was delicious. One of the things I enjoyed most about fly camps was that you didn't have to worry about cleaning up in case Jim arrived while you were away. All my camps were delightfully untidy. Dirty Mug, Burnt Billies, Bones, Dog Tucker, and fish heads lying around the fire. Tent just hung anyhow between 2 pongas, and no need to get up too early on cold mornings. I thought of Wilmer and his lectures on civilized behavior, and it made me happier still. I took the left fork of the Rockaturi and wandered slowly upstream, keeping Flynn in behind me. Yesterday's aches and pains vanished as I limbered up, and the day was fine. The creek here was only knee-deep, and there were mossy flats with plenty of fresh deer sign, though the stags had all stopped roaring. A blue boar was poking round in some crown fern as we came round the second bend from the camp, and I grabbed Flynn and threw a rock to scare the boar away. I was after deer, and pigs are too noisy. 4 deer, and 3 hours later we came to a long bush flat where the trees were enormous. Great groves of Rimu, Totara, and Kahikatea towered hundreds of feet above the rest of the bush. Mobs of pigs lived in the boles of these trees, and the ground everywhere was plowed soft with their rooting. It was impossible not to indulge in a spot of pig hunting. Flynn was let off, and the whole place erupted with wildly scoffing pigs. Small mobs of 6 or 7 darted here and there, while the sows with young litters stood their ground, squealing angrily. Flynn didn't know which one to grab. I sketched him onto a sow that was backed up to a rata, and by the time we'd finished her off, there wasn't a pig left on the flat. You never get many out of a big mob like that, so I didn't mind that we'd nailed only one. I kept Flynn from chasing after the rest by tying him to my belt for a while. The stags started roaring at dusk, when it was too dark to go after them, but it didn't matter much. We'd had a pretty easy day and got 8 deer and 2 pigs. Tomorrow we'd have a lash at the right fork. The evening was cold and still. Stags roared mournfully up and down the valley. A pair of blue mountain ducks went scree-screeing up the creek, and possums croaked in the trees. The creek gurgled over the stones, and the fire cracked and hissed. The place was as quiet and peaceful as you'd find anywhere. Thank God to be away from Wilmer for a while. The right fork was a beauty, a narrow gorge that opened out into sloping ridges of beech and tawa bush, with grass and bush flats on either side of the stream. I got a stag and a hind on the first flat, and found a deer skeleton with a bullet hole in one of the shoulder blades. In the bush at the far end of the clearing, a series of old blazes on the trees led me to a campsite where somebody had stayed years before. There was a milk powder tin half full of mildewed rice, and a piece of wire to hang billies on. I had a good look under all the handy logs, but found nothing more of interest. Farther on was another gorge, where you had to keep a sharp lookout for deer in the bush above, in case they dislodged loose rock down onto you. One old hind nearly flattened me that way. I never got her either, as I couldn't climb up to her. She stood in the bush above me, just out of sight, and barked to let the other deer know we were coming. It was perpetually dim in the gorge, where the sun seldom penetrated, almost like a tunnel. The water looked black sliding over the dark stones, and everything was dank and dripping and moss-covered, the kind of place that makes you feel small and lonely. Through the gorge, the ridges leveled out again, and I could see where deer feeding by the stream had splashed water on the stones, when they'd got my scent and run up the bank into the bush. Then a stag roared quite close, so I tied Flynn up and roared back at him, hoping to lure him into the open. Stones rattled behind me, and I spun around to see another stag, a monster coming down the flats towards me. His antlers looked enormous against the background of bush, and the long black mane on his neck and belly made him look even bigger than he was. The deer I'd been waiting for 3.5 years. For the first time since I'd shot my first deer, I was stricken with buck fever. I knew I was going to miss him, but I fired anyway. The stag had been standing looking at me, and at the sound of the shot, he whirled and plunged across the flat towards the bush. As he moved, I felt calm again, and leading him by a few inches in my sights, saw him jerk as my second shot slammed into him. He ran on into the bush, and then came tumbling back out again. I sat on his quivering rump and rolled myself a smoke. I'd got myself a decent head at last, a 12-pointer, almost perfectly even, with good thick timber and a spread of about 40 inches. Not the best head in the world by any means, but pretty good for that part of the country. My only worry was how I was going to get it out. I hacked off the head and tail and carted them back to my camp at the forks. The head seemed to weigh about 90 pounds, but for the moment I didn't care. The rest of the day was mine, and I spent it cutting all the meat off my trophy and propping it in various positions round the camp in order to admire it better. Flynn was completely indifferent and couldn't seem to make out what all the excitement was about. Late that night, I was still gazing at my 12-pointer in the firelight. Next morning, I cut the ropes off the fly tent and tied the antlers onto my pack with it. It was an awkward thing, and kept getting hooked up in the bush till I was just about frantic. By 11 in the morning, we came to the top of the formidable waterfall. It was obviously impossible to go back the way we had come, with the head, and we'd taken the easiest way. So it was a case of climbing to the top of the ridge and heading south towards the lake, hoping to come down somewhere near the camp. The climb was a nightmare, an endless succession of steep rocky faces, with crumbling stone underfoot, and rotten roots and branches for handholds. Several times I thought I was done for, and Flynn had 2 falls from which I thought he would never return. The top of a ridge never looked so good. I was going to have to move to get to White Bull Beach by dark, and the only indication of where we were was an occasional glimpse of the lake on my right. I headed in what I thought was the general direction of the camp, and came down to a small side creek of some other river just before dark. Stumbling downstream in the dusk, I tripped and fell over any obstacle that happened to be on the track. I was just too tired to lift my feet. Even so, Flynn could hardly keep up with me. He could just barely be counted among the living. I was about to give up and camp for the night when I burst through a clump of pongus and recognized the main stream. We were only 20 minutes away from the camp. It took us over an hour to get there. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, and the place was dark and empty. It looked as if Wilmer had been gone for some days. I was too tired to care. I dumped my pack, dragged out my sleeping bag, and climbed in, boots and all. I flaked out more thoroughly than a man who is blind drunk. I noticed only that the sole was gone off my boot, and wondered how long I'd been walking on my bare foot. I awoke some time during the morning of the following day, had a look at the disgusting mess in which Wilmer had left the camp, fed the dog, took off my boots and sheath knife, and went back to sleep. I got up late in the afternoon and cooked myself a feed of rice and meat, then spent a couple of hours cleaning up the camp and dragging a supply of wood down out of the bush. The boat, the spare fly tent, and some of Wilmer's gear were gone, but the outboard motor, the oars, and his sleeping bag were still in the hut. It was too much for me to try and figure out. Next day, with a sack tied round my sore foot, I hobbled up river to the first waterfall and picked up my 4 tails. I shot a fawn on the tundra and carted it back to the hut for Dog Tucker, arriving just in time to see the big white tourist launch chug into the bay with Wilmer in tow. They pushed the dinghy towards the shore and left again. What I gathered from Wilmer's rather glorified account of what had been going on was that he'd set off in the boat, with the fly tent tied to a pole for a sail, to explore a few of the bays and inlets round the lake shore. He'd cruised along quite well for an hour or 2, and then got becalmed in an inlet several miles away, where he'd sat for 2 days and 2 nights, wrapped in the tent, until someone in the tourist launch spotted him, and they came to investigate. I was furious with him, though it was no use saying anything, as he was in a worse condition than I was. He hadn't neglected to tell the people in the launch that he was a government deer color. We were going to be the laughing stock of the district. Wilmer. I'd got 30 deer and 5 pigs on my trip, so I could afford to take things easy for a day or two. Wilmer, on being shown my 12-pointer, scoffed a little and said he'd wounded 2 bigger ones and hadn't bothered to go after them. After all, he said, antlers were only bone. I gave up trying to patch my boot and bought a pair of sand shoes from Wilmer for 20 rounds of ammunition. They were pretty awkward to walk in at first, but I soon got used to them. I'd been letting Wilmer string me along before going on the fly camp, more or less to humor him, but now I started getting tough when I told him he should go outside and put his foot on a leg of meat he was tearing into with his usual voracity. He was shocked and disgusted that his overfamiliarity with me had engendered contempt. When I told him his announcement that he could hypnotize absent people and even some animals and birds was absolutely baloney, he answered by saying that he would communicate with me only when I learnt to conduct myself in a manner befitting the companion of a man who was endeavoring to cultivate underdeveloped minds. I told him his words were about as long as his tapeworms, and as useless, and left on another fly camp up the river. A week later he met me at the hut door with such a billy boiling, feed passing, hand rubbing, pathetic effort to please that I started feeling sorry for him again. He must have been a bit lonely, with no one to talk to for 8 days. He talked nonsense in the dark until I went off to sleep from sheer boredom. Next morning he burbled on about a plan for draining the lake and all the rivers so that he could get all the deer when they came, desperate with thirst, to the odd water hole he was going to leave. I told him he ought to have a go at getting his feet on the deck and start talking a bit of sense, whereupon he told me in his coldest voice to confine my childish suggestions to my unintelligent contemporaries and leave him to his cerebrations, from which I wouldn't hesitate to reap the benefits should they bear fruit. I said I wouldn't gamble on his ideas ever coming to much, and he said people of my intellectual group couldn't know. They throve only on such things as gambling and liquor. I said a belly full of booze would probably finish him, and he could never afford to gamble at the rate he was making money. He'd still got only the 1 deer. Wilmer's voice was like the sharp end of a stalactite, as he advised me not to be foolish enough to start an argument which could only result in him saying things we would both regret later. You are completely out of your conversational depth, my headstrong friend, he said. If I thought that instructions to decorous conduct would be beneficial to you in any way, I would undertake to convert you from the oaf you are into some semblance of a gentleman. The necessity, however, of keeping your disgusting friend and equal Flynn out of our admittedly unimposing hut is of much greater importance to me at this stage. I have no intention of exposing myself to the diseases he undoubtedly harbors any longer than it takes to convince you of the unpleasant consequences attending the propinquity of the disgusting animal to our sleeping and eating facilities. I gathered he was dropping a hint about Flynn, who was watching from under my bunk, where he'd spent the night. I knew he had me beat there, so I chased the dog out of the hut. I'd certainly got a glimpse of old Wilmer from a different angle, like a dog that you've had for years and suddenly discover can bite. He wasn't altogether silly after all. His outbreak of sanity lasted till the following afternoon, when I came into camp and found him standing in the middle of the hut, with his eyes closed, muttering like a damp fire. He was clearing all the flies out of the hut by concentration. His failure to make any difference to the fly population was of course due to my arrival, which broke the spell. By the same method Wilmer had a lash at calming the lake, which gave us a rough trip across to Waipoa Hut the following day. The wind became stronger, the lake rougher, and it started raining like a waterfall. I told him he wouldn't make a very good miracle worker, and he protested that on the contrary he would. The elements were only in their state of turbulence because of my open disbelief in his method and lack of faith in his ability. When the weather cleared up almost a week later, Wilmer said that the effort had left him almost completely exhausted, and he spent the first fine day in his bunk. I wasn't game to start another argument with him. I had long since realized that he just wasn't cut out to be a deer color, though he would never admit the work was too much for him. Wilmer proved crafty enough, though, when it came to throwing the job in. On a cool night, after an unsuccessful day of leading Wilmer through the wet bush, we were cupping the last brew of the day in our toasting hands when I noticed that my usually talkative mate had been silent for several minutes. I got the impression that he was going to let me in on one of his important theories, just as soon as he got it all worked out in his mind. The dark corners of the hut leapt into brief existence as a length of matai burnt through and collapsed in the heart of the fire, and Wilmer's eyes reflected the muttering flames. I kicked a fallen ember, and the wind rolled gently through the beeches and poked a finger down the chimney, filling the hut with smoke. Our one candle nodded to the slow draught, and Wilmer spoke. "Barry, my boy," he said, "permit me to congratulate you on your tranquillity and peace of mind in the face of our recent hardships at the hands of the weather and the conditions under which we are living, 50 years removed from civilization. Outside, the wind seethed again through the trees and rapped on the wall with a loose board. Flynn rattled his chain under the hut. I glanced across at Wilmer and suddenly noticed how old and haggard he had become during the past 2 months, like a stag at the end of the roar. The job had really knocked him about, and I hadn't even noticed. I threw another piece of wood on the fire to cover my embarrassment, and Wilmer continued, "Your quiet and uncomplaining acceptance of the unforeseen depletion of our condensed milk and sugar rations has not passed unnoticed by me. I myself am a man conditioned to such discomforts by a life of struggle and hardship in some of the most demanding areas of the world, but I find fortitude and resolution surprising in one of your tender years. If in an unguarded moment I have directed any undeserved opprobrium towards you, I beg of you to accept my sincere apologies, and hope that you can find it possible to attribute it to the effects of our solitary existence, which cannot but affect the strongest disposition." I began to feel a bit creepy at this, and squirmed under the obviously sincere penetration of his gaze. I reached for another piece of wood and held it defensively in my hand for a few moments, before noticing and dropping it quickly into the fire. I couldn't think of anything to say that would change the subject in time to stall Wilmer's next remark. "Barry, the time has come for me reluctantly to discard your companionship and continue my search for truth and knowledge in some other part of the world. I must follow the vicissitudinous paths to which my unquenchable thirst for adventure condemns me. Now, as you know, my interest in life here has not lain in accumulating capital, with the result that I now find myself without the necessary finance to reach my next temporary resting place. If you could let me have a few shillings." With great relief I got out my best going-to-town dungarees and fished 4-pound notes out of the hip pocket. I'd been bitten for money often enough before, but this was the best I'd come across yet. Wilmer pocketed the money as though he'd earned it, and climbed into his bunk, feeling rather divided between relief at getting off so lightly and a faint surmise that I'd been had once again. I followed his example. Next morning I took Wilmer across in the boat to the base, from where he hoped to get a lift into town. I didn't like to broach the subject of the 1,900 rounds of ammunition he'd spent, because at 6 pence a round it would have left him more than broke again. He climbed out of the boat at the landing, a thin, frail-looking figure, and stood looking across the choppy waters of the lake. His lustreless hair ruffled in the wind, and his light bag of gear swung gently from one shoulder, which I noticed was just a little broader than the strap. He gazed at the dull sky, muttering like he did in his sleep, and his little pointed beard wagged as though it was waving goodbye to the lake. I wondered where Wilmer would end up. I knew I could never feel that sorry for myself, and I didn't know what to say to him or where to look. Then Wilmer reached down, shook my hand firmly, said, "God save us," and turned towards the road, his bag bumping gently on a bony hip. I watched him for a minute, then started the motor and turned out into the bay as fast as the boat would go. I had a queer feeling that something terrible would happen if I looked back. Not quite so keen. Jim called in a few days after Wilmer left and told me to pack my gear. I was to spend the last weeks of the season in the Kawaka Range near the Kaimanawas, hunting the open basins and gullies for small mobs of deer which go there during the roar. Jim had arranged an airdrop of supplies. On the way down, I got a new barrel for my rifle and bought a pair of uncomfortable boots for 50 rounds. Jim lent me his Japanese binoculars to spot the deer with. I was to rig up a base camp on the Nagamatea station and await the plane, due in 5 days. I was sorry to see Jim's greasy old felt hat with the bootlace for a band disappearing over a ridge as he left. After Wilmer, the company of the lean, slow-moving Jim, a professional to his hardened fingertips, had been more than usually welcome. A sizable portion of the keenness he set such store by trickled out of me into the soggy ground as I watched him go. The Kawaka Range was a mad tangle of rocky peaks and steep-sided gullies. Low cloud hung around the tops, and wild sheep snorted at you from the rocks below. Early snow stippled the tussock faces, and it was a job lighting a fire, because everything was wet. I found where some wild dogs had dragged a fawn into a creek and worried it to death. I cut the tail off it, and Flynn growled stiffly at the scent of other dogs. I hung my fly tent in a saddle by a patch of bush. There was plenty of wood, water, and open space for the plane to drop its load. Then it drizzled for 3 days. Once I heard the plane circling farther along the range looking for me, but the low cloud drove it away before it got to where I was. I had a bundle of dry sticks and brush in the tent, so I could get a quick fire going for the pilot to see where I was and which way the wind was blowing. But I was down to my last bit of rice before I had to use it. The morning was cold and clear when the plane roared through the saddle an hour after daylight. I lit the fire, and next time the plane came round, the first parachute drifted into the bush behind the tent. I marked where it went, and the other 6 chutes all landed in the open near the fire. Finally, the pilot free-dropped a bag of flour, waved to me, and flew off into the gathering banks of low cloud. It's always a bit lonely when the plane's just gone, but this time I was too busy catching up on my eating to notice. For the rest of the day, I erected the camp and made it as comfortable as possible. Next morning, I shot a young hind from the camp door and had brains fried in butter with onions and cheese for breakfast. It was a good day. I tramped along the ridges, rolling big stones down into patches of scrub and bush. Any deer within would come trotting into the open and stand looking about. I got 9 that way, and another 2 on my return journey to camp. But you can't come at that sort of thing too often, and it wasn't long before I was working hard for my tally. One day, when I was creeping up on 4 deer in a little basin, Flynn barked to let me know they were there. I lashed out at him with the rifle, missed, and cracked the butt on a rock. There was only half an inch of wood holding the thing together, and though I bound it firmly with sticking plaster and string, I couldn't use the rifle for a club or walking stick after that. The rifle was getting hot one day, and there were still 3 stags milling round on the opposite face, when I had to dig into the pacow for more ammunition. A bloke must be getting stale on it, should have bowled the lot with a magazine full easily enough, but I was still well up in the ammunition, and there was no need to worry myself yet. I'd been on the tops for just over a week, and had already hung 46 tails on the line. The deer were quite tame up here. I could leave Flynn tied up at the camp, and the stags only roared at the noise he made when I left him behind. In one saddle, where the deer came through onto the tops of the Nagaruroro Valley, 19 carcasses lay about in 2 acres of tussock by the time I left. The place stank like 1,000 years, and it was only 20 minutes from camp, a bit unpleasant when the wind came from that direction. Early one morning, I was perched up in some rocks, waiting for a bank of fog to lift, so I could see any deer that were feeding in the basin below, when I heard a pack of wild dogs yapping on the trail of something they were chasing up the ridge. Soon a big gray hind, her tongue hanging out, steaming as if on fire, stumbled into view through the mist with 3 raw-boned, brindle dogs snapping at her flanks. The leader, a rangy old bitch with about as much meat on her as a push bike, dragged the deer down in a hollow 40 yards below me. They started feeding off her before she was dead. I closed the bolt on a round and moved carefully to where I could get a better view. I hate wild dogs. When I was sure the deer wasn't going to get up again, I shot the bitch fair through the ear. She dropped without a sound, and the other two froze, looking round for the source of the shot. I dropped the biggest one, and the other ran off into the mist, yelping as though the devil was after it. The winter would get that one. I ran down and finished off the hind, which was trying to drag herself through the tussock on her forelegs. I'd hate to have a pack of wild dogs on my hammer. From time to time, I heard shooting across the Monson, but took no notice, thinking it was just other colors working in their block, till one day I got the father of a fright. Someone fired a shot just above where I was sitting, watching a deer through the glasses. I went up to investigate, and found two blokes on a ledge, cutting the back legs off a wild ram they'd shot. We shook hands and swapped names. I could tell by their rifles and clothes that they were private shooters and shouldn't have been in the area. But I'd been on my own long enough to appreciate a bit of company. They agreed to save all their tales for me, so I promised not to say anything about their presence. I told them how to get back through the Monson without being spotted by government shooters. They had a camp half an hour distant, so I accepted their invitation to a brew. We talked like a pack of old women. They burbled on about deer, pigs, rifles, dogs, rivers, antlers, camps, ridges, and weather, and I filled in the gaps with women, food, women, cars, and women. When dusk forced me to take my leave, they promised to call on me in a couple of days with any tales they'd got, and gave me an old pair of socks, worth more to me than anyone ever paid for them. That night a few inches of snow fell, making hunting easy and walking difficult. Within 3 days it was a foot deep, and safe travel in most places became impossible. The private shooters called in with 6 tales, for which I gave them 20 rounds, and they plodded off out through the Monson. In another week the snow was 18 inches deep, and Flynn and I were the only living things left on the tops. I cached most of the remaining grub and the tentage, and crossed the valley to the deserted Monson hut. Poor old Flynn made hard work of the snow. He'd plunge along for a few yards, and then bog down in a drift. He was worn out by the time we got below the snow line. It's funny about dogs. You lead them a real dog's life. You take them into country where rocks cut their feet till they leave blood in their footprints, and into rivers where they get swept down through rapids a man wouldn't survive. You work them in snow up to their bellies, weather cold enough to bring the wild sheep down from the tops. You send them after boars, treble their weight and size, and often enough they get ripped and hobble back to camp with a dirty gash in neck or chest. They go hungry for days when you can't get meat because of the weather. You kick them when you're in a bad mood, and after all this they still reckon you're the best bloke in the whole world. At the bottom of the ridge, I discovered that what had been snow on the tops was rain in the valley. The river had flooded, and new log jams were piled up on the bends. Several big trees had come down across the track, and in one place a slip had wiped about 50 yards of it off the side of the hill. I got a hind down by the river, and hung all the meat in a tree, because it looked as if we were in for a pretty lean period. There was practically no fresh deer sign, and even the pigs seemed to have deserted the area. I dropped my pack down a bank and broke the frame, which put me in a filthy temper. I had a big, reckless feed of macaroni and fed the dog on the last tin of bully beef. That night it snowed again, and we were stuck where we were. I couldn't get a tally anywhere. It was winter 6 weeks before it should have been, and the few stags that were still roaring weren't staying in one place long enough for me to stalk them. I hardly averaged a deer a day, and once I hunted a creek all day and never saw a single one. Flynn was showing the strain of hunting all day and not getting enough to eat, and I was getting a gutful of being cold and wet all the time. Never enough grub, and the dog with crook feet and getting skinnier and slower every day. You could count every rib in his body when he lay curled up in front of the fire. I'd lie at night when the wind was bashing on the roof with a torn section of maltoid, and an old Matai moaned about the weather behind the hut, and decide to throw in the towel at the end of the season and take a soft job in town. I'd spend the days working the rocky ridges and shingle slides at the head of the river for 1 or 2 lousy deer and a wet backside, alone and with pains in the back from wet clothes and sleeping bag and heavy packs. A man couldn't even sleep properly afterwards. Then a stag would roar across the river, and I'd lie there working out which ridge he was on, and how to get him in the morning. I'd think of how Harry would have been all for having a go at him with a torch, and I'd have had to talk him out of it. Next morning, with a good fire going, and a brew of hot tea in my hand, things wouldn't look so bad after all. Flynn would come and put his head on my knee and bludge a bit of steak with his brown eyes. Then we'd get ready to go off up the river again. Sometimes we even got a few easy ones in the river flats, and had a good start for the day. But most of the time it was just wet and miserable, the afternoons bringing more rain, sleet, and disappointment. Thus passed the last 3 weeks of the season. By this time I'd made up my mind that I was definitely finished with deer shooting. I wasn't going to ignore the warning stabs of rheumatism. I wasn't going to be like the old blokes who spend their lives in the bush and are rewarded by being crippled before their time. No, sir. A soft job in town for me. Just wait till Jim came. I'd tell him, none of your lousy winter blocks for me, Jim. 7 months of slogging for a lousy 600 pounds. All that blood and sweat for 715 deer and 72 pigs. The blokes in the YU probably had close to 1,000 each, and this was their first season. I'd get a job looking after a milk bar or something. Jim came in the early morning, just as I was swinging the first billy. "Good day, Jim," I said. "Good day." He lifted the canvas flap at the back of his truck, and an avalanche of dogs poured through the opening. They surrounded Flynn, who completely ignored them. After all, it was his camp. He went and lay beneath the last 2 legs of venison, which hung in a tree behind the hut. "Had a brew, Jim?" "Not yet, Crumpy." He dug into his pack and produced a clean mug. "Did you get any snow up there, Crumpy?" "Yeah, had to come down out of there in the finish. Got about 58 and a dozen wild sheep. Ran into a mob of wild dogs up there. Yeah, got 2 of them on a hind. Yeah? Any dog tucker here, Crumpy?" "I'll throw them a bit." Jim was always bludging meat for his hungry-gutted pack. It must have cost him a fortune in town. He busied himself with checking all the gear in the day book, while I cleaned up, shaved, and boiled frequent brews of tea. After lunch we had everything more or less straightened out. "Don't know whether I'll be back in time to start a winter block this time, Jim," I said. "Fair bit of family business and that." "That's okay, Crumpy," he said. "I'll hold a good block for you. Pigs and goats, with a few deer on the tops. Place in the Rahines. Sorted it out especially for you." "You shouldn't have gone to all that trouble, Jim. I mean, somebody else might want the place." "Yeah, but I wanted a good, keen bloke on this one. It's full of pigs, hundreds of them, and runs back into good goat country farther up. No camping on this block either. It's all hunting from huts, 6 of them right along the foot of the range. Place hasn't been hunted properly for 3 years. You'll get a pretty good tally there, Crumpy. About the best block we're doing this winter." I could see I was being got at, so I gave up the unequal contest, and we chatted about the best dogs for pigs all the way into town. I decided to just not report back to the office, or to get one of my mates to ring up and say I had heart failure. I wasn't going to be talked into going back to that racket again. Jim dropped me off at the railway station, shook hands, and said he was very pleased with my shooting. "I'll get you a good, keen man for a mate this winter, Crumpy," he said. "Hell,